panel, Maximising Liquidity with a Limited Supply of Offshore RMB. I'd just like to firstly introduce my fellow panelists, if that's okay. On my immediate right, we have Mark Gem, Executive Board Member of Clearstream, based here in Luxembourg. On my far left, we have Pierre Jonde, Head of Corporate Trust Services at BNP Paribas, based in Paris. On my immediate left, Deborah Moore, Western European Head for Treasury and Trade Solutions at Citi, also based in Paris. And on my immediate right, Mr. Yi Shang, Managing Director at Vision Gain Capital Limited, based in Hong Kong. So welcome to you all. To open the session, I'd really just like to unpack the subject matter, ladies and gentlemen, before we start. I mean, the subject title is quite intimidating, Maximising Liquidity with a Limited Supply of Offshore RMB. I'm going to ask each of you in turn just to say a few words about yourselves, your role, but in particular what the task of maximising liquidity in an offshore RMB market means from your perspective and from that of your organisation. Maybe, Deborah, if I could start with you.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm currently based in Western Europe, and Western Europe head of Treasury and Trade Solutions, but I've actually just returned from 3 years in China. I was based in Shanghai, where I was working with our corporate clients to help them manage their liquidity, both internally, onshore and offshore. And so just to frame it a little bit, when I arrived there in 2010, we'd been working with a lot of the companies to really focus on their onshore liquidity management. And they're operating there. Many of these companies, these are large foreign multinational companies, are operating with anywhere between 10 to 100 legal entities across China. And each one of those entities could have a minimum of 5 bank accounts. And then when you add foreign currency accounts, it gets even more complex. So we were working with them really focused on managing domestic liquidity in China. But while I was there, it was absolutely astounding to see the reforms that began, and it was a long, I can't say it was a long time ago. It was actually in 2012 that it started with really small bite-sized pilots of, as we talked about a little bit earlier this morning, of initiatives and liberalization that began to make it easier for companies to operate, to manage their liquidity. And it was a very, very interesting time to be there because it just sort of happened then in very rapid succession. So where we stand today is really a series. Honestly, we've seen about 30 different initiatives come up over the past 3 years. And I'm sure we're going to continue to see a lot more.
Deborah, thank you very much. Pierre, if I could pass to you, please. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bob. Well, first of all, as a corporation, BNP Paribas has been operating in China for over 150 years, and we have many interests in the RMB story, namely on the capital investment bank side, through FX or interest rate swaps or syndicated loans. So all of the trading layer. On my more direct remit, on the security services side, we've been present in Hong Kong for a number of years and supporting a number of issuers and as well mainland China entities moving internationally. May these be broker-dealers or asset managers. Personally, my interest in the RMB story goes back for a few years. I've actually came back from Australia a couple of months ago, and when you are in Australia, the China story is very close to home. They even say that investing in the Aussie dollar is investing in China by proxy. There was the stimulus package, which stimulated the Australian economy. Thank God for the commodities exports. So the China story is something that you live and breathe every day in the financial markets down there. And last year, we sponsored a roadshow throughout a number of capital cities in Australia around the international of the RMB, because we felt that it was going to be coming very close to being implemented, and we wanted to raise awareness within the trustee community for the pension funds around what it meant for the financial markets. So very naturally, when Luxembourg for Finance asked in January for a speaker within BNP Paribas, I was very pleased to be able to put my hand forward.
Yeah, thanks very much. Mr. Yishang.
I was involved in the RMB internationalization. I think it can be as early as the end of 2008. That time, just like the Minister of Finance, Luxembourg, said the RMB internationalization began in the financial crisis. It's not a coincidence. When the financial crisis happened, US dollar liquidity outflow from the emerging economies. One of the economies, that's the South Korea, the central bank approached the PBOC, say, hey, now we don't have the foreign reserve foreign currency. It already has a negative impact on our trade between the South Korea and China. Can you provide can we have the arrangement to provide RMB, because the trade between the South Korea and China account a large part of the South Korea in the international trade. So the trade between two countries will not avoid impact by the US dollar liquidity tightening. That's why the first currency swap was happened between the South Korea Central Bank and the PBOC. It's not between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the PBOC. So for this case, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority a little bit jealous of the South Korea. So when we're talking about the internationalization of RMB in the early 2009 in Beijing, a key question for the debate is can we do that? Even the Chinese government want to get the RMB internationalized, but if the market, overseas market don't have no interest, it's only one way, that it will not make will not work for the internationalization of RMB, And the condition for the Chinese, for RMB internationalization, different from the other countries or currencies. Our capital account is under strict control, and RMB is not fully convertible, and the capital account is controlled. So at that moment, many scholarship and all economists argue that it may not make it possible for the RMB internationalization. That's the background for the RMB internationalization. That's what I get involved in. Take part in the process.
Yishang, thank you. We'll come back to that point very shortly. Mark, I'd just like to give you opportunity just to introduce yourself and your role a bit more fully.
Okay, well, Bob, yes, as you know, I've been responsible for market development, what we call network management and product management at Clearstream for some time. I mean, actually, I'm now going to be focusing on other issues going forward. But the renminbi is something I followed, at least from my perspective, from an early stage, and with nothing like your insight. But I must say, when it first came along, my attitude, I think our attitude, was a little bit passive. You've got to understand at Clearstream, what we try to do is we try to make all markets, all products available to all market participants globally. So when we learnt that a third of the world's population was making its currency, as it were, available to be held offshore, albeit not in a fully convertible form, our decision to make it eligible as quickly as we could was not based on a deep strategic analysis of how long it would take for the currency to establish itself as a reserve currency. Much more simply, because it was there. And the attitude that we have is, well, we'll facilitate that. So we're here to provide tools to the market. Nonetheless, I think we were taken aback. I do remember that the very first number I read about this was guidance given by the People's Bank of China in the context of the appointment of Bank of China as the Hong Kong clearing agent in 2010, was 16 billion US dollars. Total market size, or 15 or 16, something like that, which in our business is buttons, really. So we rather took that to heart and felt that this was going to be a very long haul journey. But we ourselves had, within a month or so, more than that in terms of balances and securities issued. So it accelerated very, very quickly from that point on, and we followed it with a lot of interest. So clearly what we do at Clearstream, make the currency eligible for payment, make sure people can issue securities. And that's what we've done. And we're looking forward now to other value-added products. We can talk about that sometime later. But we were there at the outset, and we were very, very pleased that we were. And so, as I said last night, the first dim sum bond in London was actually issued in Luxembourg.
An interesting point, yes, one that I've heard a couple of times in the course of my visit to Luxembourg already, so I think it's important to highlight that. So. Thanks to you all for setting the tone. Interesting, Mark, you make the point about the size or the People's Bank rather cautious expectation with regard to the growth of the offshore marketplace, 16 billion you intimate at this point. I think it's also important to recognise that the People's Bank was also quite clear at that time what this initiative was and what it wasn't. It was definitively an effort to encourage the renminbi as a trade invoicing and settlement currency. It wasn't at that point particularly a step towards more complete capital account liberalisation. Mr. Yixiang, I mean, you were sitting inside the People's Bank and HKMA in years leading up to this. Can you share a little bit more, in terms of the insight with regard to, retrospectively, whether the process has advanced broadly as the People's Bank and HKMA envisaged it would? I mean, where have been the points of departure from this expected journey, and to what degree is this aligned with their expectations?
I think let me relate to the source of liquidity for the RMB in overseas market. We know when the currency go into the international, we usually have two channels. One is the current account channel. The other is capital account channel. If we go through the current account channel, that means China have to maintain the trade deficit. But in the past 30 years, and in coming maybe 10 or longer, I think China will still maintain its trade surplus. That means the current account, the RMB, cannot provide to international markets. Therefore, another channel is the capital account. But now the capital account is still under the control by the People's Bank of China. The concern is the Central Bank of China want to, when they tightening or when they control the monetary policy in China for the economic reason, for the domestic economic reason, they want to the most extent to prevent the money inflow or outflow, which may have a negative impact on the effectiveness of the monetary policy. That's the basic reason they wanted the capital account under control. But for the overseas market, when the capital market is under control, that means the money outflow or inflow under control. That's the two basic reasons why the liquidity overseas, RMB liquidity is quite tight. Now, I think the People's Bank of China will gradually open the capital account, particularly for the RMB outflows. But for the RMB outflow, that means allow the Chinese investor to invest overseas financial products. So when the Chinese investors use the RMB to invest in the financial products, I think they hope they invest in the product denominated in RMB. So just like Luxembourg, if Luxembourg have enough financial product denominated in RMB, it will attract more Chinese investors come to Luxembourg. However, it actually is the chicken and egg issue. Luxembourg need to develop more product denominated in RMB. It needs the more liquid RMB here. That's the dilemma nowadays.
Thank you. Deborah, could I pass that in your direction? I mean, it is a fascinating chicken and egg. I mean, more RMB denominated products, more investment coming outwards.
But I also think that we also need more commercial flows. I think the commercial flows are really important to get that going. Right now, it's still, it's growing very rapidly, but it's still relatively low. And it's not easy to convert currencies on the commercial side. It's not just a question of redenominating a payment instrument from US dollars to renminbi. So our clients have really started with intercompany flows because that's easy. They control both the buyer and the seller. And so that started, but it's still very hard. They actually have to do a lot of systems changes, and they have to renegotiate contracts. And then when you add on third-party suppliers and buyers, then that also gets even more complex. It's very time-consuming. So it's going, but it's not going to happen overnight. But we're seeing more and more. And it was very clear this morning, confirmed what we heard from everybody, and that confirms what I see as well, is that the French, German, Swiss, UK, Luxembourg, Italian, even Spanish companies are very much ahead in this game, and they're doing really a great job focusing and using the renminbi. One, because they're used to managing multi-currencies, right? A lot of them are, before the euro, we had all different currencies. And so it makes a great deal of sense for Europe really to lead this effort. And I think as well, what's also very interesting to see is the relaxation and the facilitation of flows between individuals. So now Chinese individuals onshore can use the renminbi to pay for items that they purchase on the internet offshore. And that, getting renminbi into the hands offshore as well, is going to be very interesting. But then we're going to need to supply bank accounts in renminbi offshore. People need to do something with that renminbi that we're going to be holding offshore. So we need, again, those investment options and investment instruments. And again, those tourists coming out of China, everybody predicts, every study predicts that these are the highest spending and the most populous tourist population. If they come out with that renminbi and bring it into our economies, that's going to help tremendously as well.
Thank you, Deborah. Pierre, do you want to add?
Yes, well, I totally agree. A little story that was one of my first days back in Paris, and I was walking in Avenue de l'Opéra, and I saw an ICBC branch, free advertising for you guys. And I saw an ICBC branch. I said, well, it wasn't there a few years ago. And I was just passing by, and I saw a big ad on the outside saying invest in RMB term deposit, dépôt à terme. It brings you up to a 5% remuneration when you know how much is paid on the euro. It seemed like a very compelling story. So I think that it may be just a little story, but fundamentally there is a fundamental trend on invoicing trade in renminbi, and this is going to get momentum further. As an investment vehicle today, it may be just a little story, but I think that it is going to come mainstream at some stage. And to be honest, I think we should all be bracing for the phone calls from our mothers who are going to be asking us what we think about having 50,000 euros deposited in RMB, because that's going to come at some stage.
I'm going to come back to you guys very quickly, but I just want to quickly, whilst you're on this point, just come back to Deborah. I mean, prior to your current role, you spent quite a long time in corporate treasury, so you've seen this from both sides. You see this through the eyes of your clients. Where do you see current bottlenecks in terms of extending, trade activities in and getting past this cash management, liquidity, currency risk issue?
We've been talking, first of all, I agree with what was said earlier about education, okay? People don't know how to use this and what the options are. So we, definitely, large corporations are very focused on this, and you're very focused on it, judging by the fabulous turnout today. But we need to get this really into the everyday language of buyers and sellers that trade with China. So we need education. And then, and China needs to continue to facilitate it. Actually, making a payment in renminbi is complicated. They don't know how to wire, how to structure the payment instruction. And I think that CIPS, the China International Payment System, when that comes up, I think that'll be very, very important in facilitating payments. If you make it easy, if you automate it, if you digitize it, that will encourage greater trade flows, and that will really accelerate the growth in the renminbi.
So is this the preserve of the big corporates currently? I'm not just asking this to Deborah. I mean, the point was made this morning by Bernard, that
yes.
We've not gone very far down the value chain to the mid and smaller size corporates.
And so we also need to we really need to look at the whole supply chain and get that whole supply chain. And I'm even going to throw out there that there are sectors today denominated in dollars that honestly, the entire supply chain sits in China. And I got to ask, does that make sense? And, that's something that supply chain needs to look at to see, if it makes sense for them to denominate all the transactions in other currencies. There are plenty of companies operating in China that do all their transactions in US dollars or euros. And that doesn't seem to make sense.
Thank you. Anything to add, you guys? Or?
Well, I would agree very much that it's about the current accounts and not the capital accounts. And, you need to think back to 2010, the time of the currency wars with Brazil, if you can remember this far back, struggling to prevent inflows. But that seemed to be digested very, very quickly. And we've seen, we've got a proportion of securities that are already issued in renminbi internationally. And there's several interesting things about those. But I think the most obvious observation I would make is how reflective they are of the real economy. And they are financing actual investments, either by foreign firms in China, refinancing trade flows, or financing, indeed, Chinese resident issuers of financing on the backs of foreign investors. And this is very, very sound. And one of the things that we must, I think, remember more generally in Europe is that the capital markets are ultimately in the service of the real economy. And in this venture, we've been shown the way very clearly by the People's Bank of China, that is how it should be, and that is appropriate. And indeed, we could perhaps take a look at some of our other currencies from that perspective.
There is implicit in the question that we were asked to address an assumption that we are dealing with a limited supply of offshore RMB. But, how limited do you perceive that to be? How far are the limitations on that supply a constraint on the activities that you and your clients wish to engage in?
There's a story in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, an English book, where to make everyone rich, they decide to make leaves into their currency and then have to engage in a massive defoliation campaign to control inflation. The whole point about a currency is that it has limited supply. And I think the point about the signals that are there is that ultimately it is trade flows. It is it is the capital account that boundaries the supply of renminbi which is available. Other than, and you would know better than I would interpret a couple of interventions over the past couple of years, I think that I would class as they did it to remind us that they can, and that the control is ultimately there on convertibility. So I think it's much more about, on the one hand, the factors that you were mentioning, Deborah, that you don't change the invoicing and the billing practices of entire industries overnight, especially when it is obviously a grand experiment in the sense that ultimately the currency reforms are there to support the economy as a whole and society as a whole. But secondly, it's about trust and confidence. If supply to a currency is limited, then by definition, the art of central banking is by being reasonably obscure about where those limits will be found. Then what the market needs is experience. They need credit tools to be developed. They need to sound out over time the credit appetite of their counterparties, et cetera, and those things are discovered in essence in a trial and error way. There are things that we can do to promote tools that will support that, particularly through collateral management and securitization, as you've mentioned. But ultimately, people have to find this out for themselves, and that takes time.
Yeah, I've asked a question around liquidity to a number of treasurers and CFOs with a number of issuers that I regularly meet, and the answer that I got was, it's not a single answer to the question. There's actually two different levels. The first one is around the trade and the liquidity of the foreign exchange activity. And everybody I've been speaking to was actually quite comfortable with the amount of liquidity that you had in these markets, whether it be in Asia, and they were talking about anywhere between 20 and 25 billion RMBs traded per day, or in Europe, where it was anywhere between 5 and 10 billion RMB traded per day. So from an FX standpoint, hedging trades, hedging the trading and the commercial activity, liquidity didn't seem like an issue. Now, when we're talking about the possibility of raising assets or issuing bonds in RMB, the liquidity is clearly not as deep. Treasurers to whom I've spoken to were happy to do a number of trials and issuing some bonds and seeing how it worked and making sure that they had the right experience and all the and bleeding their nose on a smaller issue that wouldn't be overly strategic in terms of financing. So they were very happy to trial to test the concept. One of them told me, but if tomorrow I needed to raise €1 billion, I'd do it in euros and I'd swap it back to RMB. So the depth of the liquidity of being able to raise funds in RMB isn't there yet. It is probably going to come because you can't totally dissociate the real economy from the financial markets, but I think it is still a few years out.
Thank you, Pierre. Deborah, you had a point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. You know, I think we believe as well that there's sufficient liquidity right now for all the trade. The question is can we manage it better? And by managing it, meaning do we have the liquidity in the right place at the right time? And I think we can be more efficient about it. One of the things we're considering and we're talking in the UK about is once we get an international RTGS system up and running for the renminbi, is should we make it a CLS currency for continuous link settlement? And that will really help, you know, the efficient settlement, foreign exchange settlements, and I think that will make it easier for everyone to manage.
Mr. Yusheng, you were making some interesting points in your opening comments. I mean, you particularly reflected on obviously the current account surplus and the fact that that's obviously not going to be a great contributor to offshore liquidity for that reason. Clearly, there are other valves on the pressure cooker. You've got the QFI window and you've got the QD window. QD window effectively should provide a valve through which capital can flow outwards from mainland institutional investors. Clearly, again, we've got central bank swap lines in place should they be utilised. But how far do you see there being an offshore liquidity constraint, and what are the steps to addressing this?
From the Hong Kong experience, I think the liquidity limitation is partly due to the number of market participants. If the number of market participants is large enough, then the liquidity will going up. Just looking at the one example, it says like the Hong Kong stock exchange list reach the property reach denominated in RMB. I think that reach is originally owned by the Ligaxin company, but you can see it's the only equity like the securities denominated in the RMB and then listed in Hong Kong Stock Exchange, but the liquidity quite small. So talking about the liquidity from outflow from the China RMB to overseas markets, nowadays just like the QD, the original QD was for the public individual investor, and then now we have the specific QD. Any institutional investor or even the corporate or the company, if they want to invest in overseas markets, they can go to the trust company to have the QD quota. It's quite easy to apply to get the allowance to invest overseas. Even one of my clients already have I got the mandate to looking for the some target in Europe. So if the target company can fit his criteria, we can go to the trust company to get a QD arrangement. But I think this is still quite a limited way. For the long-term development of overseas RMB markets, maybe PBOC need to relax a little bit more on the control, capital account control. And in addition to the two channel now, I think this is a quite innovative way for the PBOC to provide RMB liquidity for the international markets. That's the currency swap with the 20-something central banks. Now the swap agreement is from the PBOC and the other countries' central bank is for the urgency need. I think the further development can be allow the overseas central bank to provide the RMB facility to the local commercial banks. So when the local commercial bank get the RMB credit line from its central bank, then you can provide the RMB liquidity to the corporate entities or any other institutional investor when they make a decision to invest in RMB. That will be helpful for the RMB, for the resolve of the RMB liquidation.
Thanks very much, Mr. Yusheng. That's very useful. You know, Mark, I think we need to move on to talk a little bit more about the key role of Europe's different financial centres in this process as well. And I'd like this to bring this back to you in passing as well. But to what degree do you envisage, therefore, the emergence of 3 or 4 European financial offshore RMB centres working in collaboration? I mean, is this necessarily a conflictual relationship between those centres emergent, or do you see, as several intimated in the morning session, there may be opportunities for each to have their area of specialisation and to work in consociation, if you like?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been a little bit surprised by how conflictual it's become. I mean, especially in Europe, where, as Mr. Marsh was saying, we have a single currency. And the swap line is for the ECB, not for individual countries. But I think the whole thing about trade is that it's global. The whole thing about the capital markets are that they are global. The reason that we have a very high rate of renminbi denominated issuance in Luxembourg on the stock exchange in Clearstream and in the funds industry also is not because all of this is being sold to Luxembourg investors or financing Luxembourg's heavy industries. It's simply because this is a meeting point for the world's capital markets. And indeed, if we look at the renminbi in a more general sense, why would we expect it to be particular? The fact that there are capital account controls does not mean that there would be or should be or even could be expected to be barriers between the flow of liquidity from one European center to another or from one North American center to another. It is, like the US dollar or like the euro, a single fungible currency. And this is often overlooked. And I think the reasons for that are a little bit the solutions that were adopted back in 2010, and I would defer to you on this, but it seems to me that the need to facilitate current account payments whilst at the same time maintaining capital account controls led to a tactical solution of appointing certain clearing banks whose access to the marginal lending facility, etc., could be tightly circumscribed. And that all made sense, but it also led to a degree of confusion. I was looking through today, for example, the customer service queries that we in Clearstream get on the renminbi, and they were all things like, I've got some renminbi in Hong Kong and my manager wants me to credit them to you. How do I do that? Because, you know, they're CNHs and not CNYs and so forth. And of course, when CIPS is rolled out, which I understand is still programmed for this year, all of this should move away. Now, in Hong Kong, we all know that they're very efficient. You know, in China, they've made 36,000 kilometers of roads in the time that it is. Here in Luxembourg, we have not completed the Route du Nord. So what they've done in terms of that clearing facility is it's open till 11 p.m. in Hong Kong. That means that it is open for us here in Europe until 5 p.m. Well, there are European currencies which you can't settle as late as 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So in practice, there is no, from a liquidity perspective, there is no specificity from infrastructure that I would expect to see in any one European structure, center, or any center globally. I think what it is about is providing one's local industry, one's, in the case of Germany, with the Mittelstand, for example, with the tools to raise capital in renminbi, to fund themselves in renminbi in a way which is adapted to their local needs. That is the role that the individual financial centers can play. Luxembourg, I see a little bit different. We've always been the facilitator of the euro markets, and now the renminbi is here to play a key role in the euro markets for the next generation and the generation after. That is the role that Luxembourg has played. That is the role that Luxembourg must in the future play.
Thanks very much. I'd like to put a similar question. I'll move straight to you, Deborah.
Okay, I would add, I agree, you know, from the capital perspective that Luxembourg definitely has a very special role to play. But I would also say that for Luxembourg, it's also the Chinese banks here. And we're counting on all of you from the Chinese banks to really help drive that growth in renminbi by doing, you know, renminbi-denominated loans, providing additional trade services, cash management services, securitizations, whatever it is that the underlying markets need. We need the help of the Chinese banks as well to help drive that.
Yeah, do you have a view? Conflict versus consociation?
No. Maybe just a comment around the SME in Avignon who would have an issue in dealing with RMB. I think the answer lies in the education of the bank networks, but for the CFO of that company, whether the RMB is coming from or where it's going, as long as it gets to his supplier in China, I mean, the rest is not relevant. So I think the concept between having the various clearing centers will be quite obscure for the average corporate CFO. He will not care, actually. he will not want to know.
In fact, yeah, they wanted to make it, it's got to be simple, it's got to be easy.
Yusheng, I mean, you've clearly had close company with policymakers in China and Hong Kong over the years. Do the Chinese authorities care whether, multiple centres emerge in Europe and other parts of the world? Are they quite happily for this to sort of evolve down to one? What do you feel is the preference from the Chinese authorities' standpoint?
Yeah, I think to my knowledge, the Chinese authority quite happy to have multiple centres. Of course, Hong Kong would like to be the sole center, but for the PBOC, say, okay, any country or any center like to have the RMB, that's fine. My simple suggestion for the Luxembourg, I think maybe Luxembourg should make a preparation of particular infrastructure for the Chinese visitors. Just like the speaker this morning mentioned that in Hong Kong, now over 30, this year maybe about 40 million Chinese visitors will visit Hong Kong. To make the Hong Kong too crowded and the Hong Kong local resident against the Chinese visitor. So I think Luxembourg is no big country. When the Chinese come here 1 million, can the infrastructure afford to the 1 million Chinese visitors here?
Deborah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the sort of evolution of capital market products. And I mean, Luxembourg has been active in supporting offshore dim sum issuance. I mean, I think it's the Luxembourg Exchange supports, the second largest volume outside of Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken. But do liquidity constraints limit the current tone and size of issuance? I mean, tenors have been quite short so far. There's clearly a concern over liquidity for repayments of coupon and capital.
I don't think we're going to have a concern about the repayments. Some of the repayments should start happening. In fact, I think they've probably already began. A lot of the repayments are happening now. And there is enough. These dim sum issuances were really bite-sized. So there's sufficient liquidity for repayment, and there's sufficient sources of liquidity. If you look at the various sources of liquidity, at this point in time now, a lot of the companies that initially had cash-trapped issues onshore in China can now very easily move that cash offshore. And so, that's working, that works well. So there are plenty of various sources of liquidity available. We're not concerned about it.
But the bite-sized issues so far, and that's the very point. I mean, if we're going to get them bigger and we're going to extend tenors, is this a constraint then?
Well, yes. I mean, if we extend tenors, but then there are other steps that need to be taken first before we get to the point where where we can increase it. So there are longer tenors coming in. Some of them we have seen some longer tenors beyond the 3-4 year mark, but I also think that it's going to it takes some more the capital account liberalization to really drive that to drive it further.
Judith, do we have a voting question? That seems to dovetail. Thank you. Very nice.
If you would like to grab your remote controls again, at this point we have wonderfully fittingly, a question that regards just what you mentioned, Deborah, among others, as an answer, developing RMB capital markets and focusing on the developing of the yield curve, as it were, bringing in more issuers, bringing in more investors. So the question is, given the limited offshore supply, what do you think, in the audience, should be priority to maximize liquidity? So feel free to select one. What do you feel is at this point in time, or after you heard all the discussions up to this point today, facilitate flows between offshore pools and markets with excess demand? One approach, as far as I know here, is the development of the tri-party repo system. Then we heard about developing RMB capital markets, so this goes to what Deborah was just mentioning. Seems not to be a concern at this point. And then, of course, introducing benchmarks also and developing products for RMB investment. For example, the CNH hybrid fixing has been mentioned in markets as one of the key points to mention here. So I leave this to discuss within the panel as well, and we're looking at the audience. I will make my selection as well. we see where this is going. Here we go. There you have your answer.
Thank you very much. 39% facilitate flows between offshore pools and markets with excess demand. 32% develop RMB capital markets. And 29% introduce benchmarks and develop products for RMB instruments. I'd love to attract some comment. Maybe Mark, you can comment firstly on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's all three. Although I would very much reiterate what you were saying, Deborah, about trade practices. I think the two things I would focus on looking forward beyond capital account liberalization, which is quite properly a question for domestic policy formers, is firstly providing things like tri-party repo, the collateral system, so that people can swap bunds for renminbi liquidity, is probably more about building confidence, because I also agree with Pierre's assessment and yours, Deborah, that as a matter of fact, the liquidity seems more than sufficient in practice to meet, certainly within reason, the sorts of activities which are contemplated. I think the second is probably allied to another policy challenge in China, which is the deleveraging of the banking sector, the whole question of asset quality across the broad spectrum of the banking and the shadow banking sector, to which Mr. Marsh alluded earlier. Clearly, one remedy for that is securitization, which is also the question of the development of capital products. And we're seeing early signs of this, of Chinese resident issuers issuing into the offshore market, both through Hong Kong and oddly enough, to a large extent, through Luxembourg. What we would see there is that the development of that part of the capital market, if you like, the ability to issue things like Eurobonds in renminbi in order to relieve pressure from the Chinese banking balance sheet, is a very obvious melding of two policy paths which China is on today. And again, we have the tools in the international marketplace to support that from happening. So the second thing I would say is think about corporate trust, think about the issuer agency and the investment banking roles which the Chinese banks, both inside China and outside China, can play here in Luxembourg and elsewhere. Those are the learning points that I would have from this.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe one additional point, Mark. I think we talk about the internationalization of the RMB. We should as well talk about the internationalization of the Chinese issuers as well, because if you want to raise funds in international markets, it comes with a rating. It comes with a certain level of transparency in terms of governance, in terms of accounts, in terms of brand awareness more generally. So it is going to be an effort as well for the issuers. And a couple of the treasurers that I had spoken to, who had chaperoned their Chinese JVs to the offshore markets, were telling me the amount of disclosure and information they had to do was actually a surprise for them.
Does that echo your experience, Deborah?
You know what, it does. And we talked about it also earlier this morning, the fact that we need these companies to be far more visible, far more transparent, and that may not be part of the culture at the moment, but that's part of what we're looking for in order to be more confident and comfortable in the investment. So that's gonna, you know, we need to, on both sides, there needs to be some give and take, but definitely more education about the Chinese companies. And we even spend time, even internally in our organization, highlighting the Chinese companies and what they do, because they're not household names at this point in time. And so we need to really get that, you know, I need to make sure that that when, you know, the people on our teams hear about a Chinese company, that they feel this, you know, they get the same feeling and they understand that business and what they're trying to do the same way they do when they hear about Apple.
Mr. Yisheng, you know, you've got deep experience in terms of researching Chinese companies. It's what you do on a daily basis. You know, how far are you experiencing these constraints, given your proximity to the market?
Yeah, I think looking at this, I also agree with the number one. You know, for the many emerging economies have to trade with China, so actually some companies have the supply of RMB. So they go to the Bank of China or ICBC channel back to China. So if Luxembourg can attract this RMB to the Luxembourg, then I think it will be a good way to improve the liquidity here.
We're also, sorry, Judah, do we have how much? Lovely, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, recent sort of news articles also drawing attention to, you know, extension of onshore instruments. Daimler, Mercedes-Benz, you know, my understanding has recently gained approval for issuance of Panda Bond, an onshore corporate bond to be sold on the main line. Are we seeing a sort of a gradual moving towards the extension of instruments that foreign corporates can issue on the mainland, and ultimately perhaps a gradual move towards the convergence of onshore and offshore markets?
Panda Bond is the World Bank. World Bank issued the RMB bond in China. I think the other day before I came to Luxembourg, I just have opportunity to meet the official from the SAFE, a senior official. I think they have gradually relaxed the restriction to allow more well-known financial institutions overseas to issue the Panda bonds in China. I think the Central Bank of China is thinking many ways gradually to allow more capital inflow and outflow. I think that's you can see the Governor Joshua Trump, he's really determined to relax the control. But of course, the other department maybe have different voice. Yeah.
Thank you. We've not got much time left. Maybe time for one quick comment in true democratic fashion. Whoever speaks quickest gets the say. So. Don't be too polite. Jump in.
Just very quickly, we talk about the flows in Europe as well, but we're also transacting in renminbi across 50 countries these days. So it's not just limited to Europe. So there are corridors that are really important as well in renminbi flows, and we need to look at those. So what goes on between China and Hong Kong and the rest of the countries is important, but there are other flows as well that will make sense.
I actually wanted to make exactly the same point. If we look at the dim sum bonds that have been issued, who's holding those? We say they're Luxembourg and perhaps London, and we see this as a European thing. 85% of the holders are Asian. Over 50% of the issuers are Asian. This is a global market, and we mustn't fall into the trap of believing that we're fragmenting something before it's even begun.
Point of fairness, have a final word, Pierre.
Just a thought. I listened very carefully to Martin's presentation last evening, and just reflecting upon the fact that today China is about 15% of world's GDP, and if I note it down properly, it should be around 34% in 15 years, something like that. And RMB has been liberalized for what, 3, 4, 5 years. Now, let's say in 2030, I mean, this conversation will be around probably how, is there any other reserve currency than the RMB?
Thanks very much to my fellow panelists for educating me. Excellent. And I look forward to the next session, and thanks to Judith and the organisers for most excellent conference.